Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archeo Viking. Today, I have one yet another special guest onto the channel. The guest for today is Dr. Timothy May, who is a historian who specializes in the Mongol Empire, and I have him here today to talk about the Mongol Empire as well as what he calls the Chinggis Exchange. So, with that, Timothy, Dr. May, why don't you introduce yourself
Hi,
to our
I'm
group?
okay. Hi, I'm Dr. Timothy May. I'm a professor of Central Eurasian History at the University of North Georgia, and I'm also the Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Letters there.
Okay. Um, and what sort of how did before we get into the main subject, like how did you get into, Eurasian history and things like that in your career? Uh,
My interest in the Mongol Empire and Central Eurasia in general began in probably the fifth grade when I read a book by Harold Lamb on Chinggis Khan,
hmm,
found in the school library, and just captivated my attention. And so he always sat in the back of my mind. And I would return to look in the Mongols or the Huns or something like that every so often. And then in college, when I was floundering around for what I was really interested in history, I read another book on the Mongols, and that kind of cemented it. And away we go. I've been doing this seriously since probably my junior year of college, long, long time ago.
hmm. And it's funny you mentioned that book because my middle school had, I think, had the exact same book in the library, a little thin brown book, or something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah,
I think ours had a dust jacket with a cellophane on it.
Yeah, yeah, that's yeah, pretty standard. Um, okay, so with that, why don't you give those of us those of the viewers who are watching who may not necessarily, either may only know of Genghis Khan, instead of Chinggis Khan, give a little background about like the Mongol Empire that's not necessarily, in TV shows or things like that.
Okay,
Uh, yeah.
sure. The Mongol Empire forms in 1206 when Chinggis Khan uh, basically unifies the steppes.
Mhm.
The Chinggis Khan is a title. It means firm or fierce ruler. And over time in English, it becomes the G word. I don't say it. John Wayne died from cancer from saying it. So,
Mm.
and everyone else I know who has used the G word has also died. So, I think it's just good advice not to follow it. But Chinggis is what his name is or title. His real name is Temujin. But if you fly into Mongolia, you go into Chinggis Khan Airport, you drive down Chinggis Khan Avenue, you can stay at the Chinggis Khan Hotel, where you can order some Chinggis Khan vodka or Chinggis Khan beer at the bar, or change money at the Chinggis Khan Bank, and so forth. So um, we can say Chinggis, so we should.
Yeah.
It's not a hard phoneme to say in English. Um, but anyway, the empire forms sort of by accident. He was a vassal. His overlord gets a little jealous of him, and also there other people are jealous of him because of his success, and he wins out in a war, and is able to defeat his rivals one by one. But one of the things about him is that he has an eye for talent, regardless of social class, or any other defining characteristic. And people like working for him because he listens to them. Uh, Ultimately, he makes his own decisions, but he values the input, the advice of others, and he rewards people who are loyal to him. But not just, he doesn't like yes men. He likes
Mhm.
people who give him honest criticism and thoughts. And so he's able to attract a lot of people to him. And this will continue to be true once he starts expanding the empire, largely trying to eliminate threats to his new state in Mongolia. He was a vassal of the Jin Empire, but when the ruler that he had sworn allegiance to dies, and then a new guy comes who he has no respect for, he throws that allegiance off. And he has some scores to settle with the Jin Empire as well as hunting down some refugees from Mongolia who were his rivals as well. And then the next thing you know, he is an empire, and he does try to establish peaceful relations with some people, but that doesn't always work out. And so he goes to war with them in Central Asia, the Khwarezmian Empire, the largest empire you've never heard of. And the reason why you never heard of it is because he destroys it. They killed a caravan he sponsored, he financed, and when he tried to get reparations for it, and they then killed his ambassador and burned the beards of the guards, he decided it was time for war, and he won. And then after that, the empire just built and built, and his sons, when they looked around and saw what they had accomplished, they were trying to rationalize, well, how the heck did this happen? And they could only assume that the eternal blue heaven, Koke Monke Tingre, had bequeathed the earth to Chinggis Khan and his descendants. And so from there, we get the Mongol Empire with a raison d'etre to conquer the world, because heaven had decreed it. And if you did not submit to the Mongols, you're in violation of heaven's will and thus needed to be destroyed. And they did a pretty spiffy job along the way until they got big enough and powerful enough that they started fighting amongst themselves.
Well, and also, as you yourself have mentioned in your books, like the Mongol Art of War and the Mongol Empire and World History, they also started running into empires that were, equally as powerful, like the Mamluk Sultanate and
Well,
things like
no,
that.
that's not quite true. The Mamluk Sultanate was not nearly as powerful as the Mongols.
Oh,
Now,
okay.
the Mamluks would fight for their lives, and they learned how to fight very effectively against the Mongols.
Oh, okay.
But if they had faced a united Mongol Empire that decided to put all of its resources towards them, they would have been rolled over. The the Mamluks would coordinate their attacks on the Ilkhanate, the Mongol portion of the Middle East, often working as well. It depends on whose perspective you're taking from. If you're the Golden Horde, the portion of the Mongols in Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, you saw the Mamluks as your vassals. If you were the Mamluks, you saw them as allies. So they would coordinate some things. They supported each other, but the Mamluks never really had to face the Mongols at their full strength.
Okay. All right, and I that's a misunderstanding on my part then, because it's been a little bit since I've read your books that mention that. So, but yeah, that's very interesting to hear about. So, with that, that sort of leads us into the bulk of the video, the
Mhm.
Chinggis Exchange. So, what is the Chinggis Exchange, and what effects did it have on the world, and things like that?
Sure. The Chinggis Exchange is a term I came up with when I wrote The Mongol Conquest and World History,
Mhm.
which was published in 2012. So, wow, over a decade ago. And basically, it's the idea of a transfer of knowledge, of technology, the movement of people, of goods, of things, you name it. And it goes across Afro-Eurasia basically because of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols could either be direct agents or indirect in this. So you have a exchange of ideas, of goods, or just people moving around because of the Mongol conquest. And I call it the Chinggis Exchange because Chinggis Khan set the whole thing in motion. If you don't have a Chinggis Khan, you don't have this. There have been many empires coming out of Mongolia, nomadic empires, but none of them had the same impact as the Mongol Empire. And these exchanges alter the world from what it was before the rise of Chinggis Khan. And you can't go back. I mean, if you just look at a map, the world is very different after the Mongols compared to when they started. You see a number of kingdoms, states, empires, whatever you want to call them. All of these polities are gone and new ones arise. But most of them have some connection to the Mongols, whether they're ruled by former generals or descendants of generals or descendants of Mongol leaders, or they were created in the chaos of the decline of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire never really falls. It just doesn't like have a nice, neat stopping point.
Yeah.
It fades away.
Mhm. And
Um,
yeah, and actually, I like you pointing that out because so often you hear, oh, the Mongol Empire fell in 1368, and that's like, well, that's really just the Yuan section because the Golden Horde lasts a little bit longer than that, and then the Timurids and you know,
yeah, and
yeah,
the Yuan, it doesn't end in 1368. They just
yeah,
lose ruling in China, but the Mongol Empire in East Asia was much larger than what we
yeah,
think of China. And when I say China, I'm talking about historic China, not
hmm
the modern PRC, which also includes parts, well, Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet. Uh, Chinese claims to those territories come about with conflict with the Mongols and, of course, then the Qing Empire, the Manchu Empire
yeah,
rise. And um, what happens is that in Mongolia, in the steppes, you still have what is historians call the Northern Yuan Empire.
mhm,
And for a long time, there's still a lot of groups that recognize them as the legitimate rulers, and the Ming Dynasty is, Johnny come lately, and
mhm,
things will shift. They'll compete for influence. The Ming will also play a lot of games to attract Mongol support, other Mongol groups, um, until basically the turmoil within the Northern Yuan territories will decide it for them. Basically, in the early 1400s, there's enough civil war and chaos that it's no longer sustainable, and even that then again fades away,
mhm.
and will resurface. I don't think you can really say the Northern Yuan is truly gone until 1636,
Mhm.
when they submit to the Qing dynasty.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Also, what you could argue that the Mughal Empire in India being started by offshoots of Timur's empire could sort of, at least in its early years, be a continuation of the Mongol Empire as
Well,
well. But
that gets a little tricky because
yeah,
um, the Moguls are Timurids, meaning they're descended
Mhm.
from Timur, and Timur did have a Chinggisid wife,
Mhm.
and he used the title Kurugin or Gurugin, which
Mhm.
means son-in-law, meaning the son-in-law of Chinggis Khan, and this becomes sort of an imperial title, an institution. But when Timur is rising to power in the late 1300s, um, his stated goal is to restore the Mongol Empire, and he
Mhm.
keeps Chinggisid prince on the throne. He goes through three of them. He never claims to be the ruler.
Yeah.
People know who's really pulling the strings here, but after the last one of those dies, he never replaces it. And because of his own achievements, he's established enough charisma that his descendants can truly be their own men, own
Okay.
dynasty. And the Moguls will be an offshoot of that, basically, after they get chased out of Central Asia by the Uzbeks. And they establish themselves in northern India. But the funny thing about the Moguls is that ruling India was never, at least for Babur, never something he truly, truly wanted to do. He always wanted to go back to Samarkand.
Mm.
And northern India was just sort of the bank. India has always been an ATM to warlords in Central Asia.
Yeah.
You go, you plunder, you get some funding, carry on your wars. But yes, you are right in that there's always a connection. And the fact that they're called the Mughal Empire, this comes from the people they conquer in India, who attribute Mughal is simply Mongol in Persian. And it it comes from the invaders coming from Central Asia, they're Mongols because the Mongols have been raiding India for well since the 1220s. And so that legacy of the Mongols is still there and gets attributed to them, even though I don't think you could really call them Mongol anymore by that point. They're heavily Turkicized,
Yeah.
but the Moguls themselves would be a continuation of the Chinggis or the Chinggis Exchange, much like the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty rises out of the Mongol Empire through rebellions, but they retain a lot of Mongol institutions early on. They're, excuse me, the Ming are always cast as xenophobic.
Mm.
Well, in the early days, not so much. There are a lot of Mongols working with them. They attract Mongol soldiers. They're always trying to get Mongol princes to switch their loyalties to them. And there's a great appreciation for the Mongol state. And in truth, any civilization, in any empire that rises, even if you don't like the order before, you don't completely discard everything, because to rule something, you got to use the institutions you're familiar with and what other people are familiar with. Like if we decide to, I don't know, if we go to Mars and set up a new society, I'm going to bet everything that it's going to be similar in structure to our own. You might want to say we're going to reinvent everything, but you're still going to use institutions of your own society because that's what you're familiar with. You know how to do it. So all the successors of the Mongols, whether it's the Ming, whether it's the Moguls, whether it's Muscovy, they're all pulling from the Mongol Empire. Now later, as they become more established, they'll deny anything about this. Say, oh no, the Mongols are terrible. We wanted nothing to do with them. But if you peel back the paint and the wallpaper on it, you'll see the Mongol stuff.
Yeah. Okay, and what other types of things would be, transferred across Eurasia due to the Chinggis Exchange?
Well, the Mongols are often best known for warfare, so that's one area. Gunpowder is one of the most obvious ones. Gunpowder existed in warfare, and the Mongols encountered gunpowder weapons, usually in the form of bombs, but also incendiary weapons. Well, basically rudimentary flamethrowers known as fire lances. They were bamboo tubes filled with a gunpowder concoction. There's different formulas for gunpowder, some to make it explosive, some to make it incendiary. And basically this would jet out a jet of flame about maybe 10 feet long. So it was a one-use weapon. But if you get a bunch of them, that's a lot of fire. And so the Mongols would encounter this, and it was a useful thing, but it wasn't like a game changer. So you don't see a lot of mention of it. Some people have tried to say the Mongols have used this all over the places, but there's no archaeological evidence to support that outside of East Asia. And part of the reason why is, okay, it's useful, but it's not that much better. You can find other things. However, people do travel around. And so in 1250s, we have William of Rubruck. He's a Franciscan friar. He goes to the court of Möngke Khan, the fourth Mongol Khan. And then he returns back to Europe. And then not long after he returns, suddenly we see Roger Bacon writing about gunpowder. Roger Bacon's another Franciscan. He was in communication with William of Rubric. So I don't think it's just guesswork to say we know where he got it from. But others, we see gunpowder popping up here and there. Again, the Mongols aren't, saying, "Hey, would you like to buy some gunpowder?" Well, maybe someone was, but we see it also traveling by sea routes to the Middle East. We see it entering India in the 1290s through fireworks, actually. But it gets around and people start using it, and so it spreads. And if you look at early European gunpowder weapons, they look very similar to the weapons that are being used in the late Yuan Empire. The first cannons do not show up until the Yuan Empire in the 1280s, 1290s, I think, is when you have the first actual cannon in use. But also we have things coming out of Europe and arriving in China. For instance, the counterweight trebuchet.
Mm-hmm.
In East Asia, they had trebuchets, but these were basically manpower. You had a bunch of ropes to a lever. You wanted to throw a heavier rock or make it go a longer distance, you put more people pulling these ropes. But in Europe, since the late 12th century, there's counterweight trebuchets. It's not clear exactly who developed them first, whether it was the Byzantines or whether it was Muslims or whether it was, I'm going to use your word, Franks, basically mean Western Europeans in the Crusades. But we see them being used in the Crusades, and they're quite effective. Much better range, much more destructive than a regular, man-powered trebuchet. And the Mongols start using them. And eventually, in East Asia, Kublai Khan is besieging a city. The siege is not going anywhere. They can't break it down because, most of the walls of cities there are earth-packed. So you throw rocks at it, and you're just adding something to the earthen wall. And also these cities are being reinforced by rivers and through a navy on a river and so forth. And eventually he asks for the Mongol ruler in the Middle East to send him some engineers to make these, and they call them Muslim catapults, basically, or hui hui pao, which later becomes also a word for cannon. You get words being used for lots of different things over time. And these counterweight trebuchets are built in China by Muslim engineers. Marco Polo will take credit for it, but he arrives several years after this event. But to his audience, they don't know any better.
Yeah.
But that's what turns the tide is the use of the counterweight trebuchets. Because they're so destructive, now they can drop huge rocks, but also gunpowder bombs into the city and not just at the walls. So we have that kind of technology. We see other weapons and styles of armor. People, it's like many sports. Once you find a team that's very dominant with certain strategies and things like that, like they always say the NFL is a copycat league. Well, everyone does that. If you're fighting someone and you're getting beat all the time, what do? Do you change how you fight? Do you change your weapons? We see this with the Mongols. People start fighting in different styles. The Rus in Ukraine, what is Russia now? They'll adopt Mongol warfare tactics and also armor, weaponry, styles of fighting. They go from looking more like be simplistic, Vikings.
Yeah.
Infantry, cavalry using spears and things like that, to becoming more like horse archers, nomadic horse archers, and adopting the same kind of armor. The armor that you have in your background is lamellar.
Yeah.
What's neat about lamellar is because of the overlapping plates, whether it's leather or metal, it provides much better protection against arrows than, say, chainmail does. And so they'll adopt that as well. Many people, cavalry in particular in Eastern Europe, will also start using the saber. Now, the saber has been in use for centuries, but it doesn't really become popular until the arrival of the Mongols in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. And again, why? Well, because the Mongols are so successful. The saber is perfect for using on horseback as opposed to a straight sword. So people will start using that as well. Other things that are going back and forth. Non-warfare, knowledge, just knowledge in general. In China, during the Yuan Empire, the Eastern Mongol Empire, ruled most famously by Kublai Khan, we'll see the establishment of academies and for science of various sorts, such as astronomy. We'll see Muslim astronomers operating in China, as well as Chinese astronomers operating in the Middle East. Also, artists go back and forth. In Tabriz, in modern-day Iran, there's a workshop that will have not only Chinese artists, but also Persians and Italians and Armenians all working together. And their influences will exchange. And as I said in my book, The Mongol Conquest and World History, the Mongols don't cause the Renaissance, but without them, it's going to look very different, because you're not going to have the different influences commingling together and then spreading. But in some ways, the Mongols do greatly assist the Italian Renaissance, because they set conditions where trade becomes much easier. They provide security so that you can move goods across Eurasia much easily, much cheaper. They're not going over, like through 30 different territories, each one where you're paying a tax or a tariff. It's still not quite as safe as one writer who, I can't remember who it was, but he said basically a virgin could walk with a vase of gold and jewels on her head from one end of the empire to the other and be unmolested. That's probably a slight exaggeration, to say the least, but the point was, it's much safer than we've ever seen before. And we do see merchants from all over the place operating long distance trade, whether they're Armenians, Italians, Chinese merchants. Many of them still use proxies and middlemen, but they set up these great networks. Excuse me. And we have this idea of the Silk Road. Well, that's a bit simplistic, as many scholars have argued. It's silk roads or silk routes. They're going east, west, north, south. They're all connected. And it is operating at maximum under the Mongols, because the Mongols greatly promote trade. They're involved in it. They're investing in it. They'll actually bankroll merchants, and they'll get cuts or percentages of the profit. But of course, with all this transportation and movement, you also get other things like the spread of diseases. The bubonic plague is going to be the most famous one. In the mid 13th century, it's going to spread like wildfire throughout Eurasia because of the Mongols. And it's not because the Mongols are intentionally spreading it, because they're just as liable to catch it as anybody else, but they've created the conditions where all things, whether it is silk, spices, or plague-bearing fleas, can move around pretty easily through the trade.
And what about medical knowledge, since we're on the subject of the bubonic plague? Because I am aware of a couple of scholars who have talked about the medical knowledge, transfer of medical knowledge both ways.
Yeah, medical knowledge also gets exchanged, and probably the leading scholar on this has been Paul Buell.
Mm.
He's written quite a lot about it over the years, and what we see is the transfer of knowledge because the Mongols, they have access to any doctor they want, whatever they favor. So if one system is not working, they'll find another. So we'll see Buddhist doctors from Tibet, Chinese medicine being used, Ayurvedic medicine from India,
Mhm.
and also Islamic medicine. And Islamic medicine is heavily influenced by Galenic medicine. Galen was a doctor in the Byzantine Empire, or Eastern Roman Empire. He wrote quite a lot. His works gets translated into Arabic. They adopt it, and so it gets used, and it also gets again a lot of syncretic activity where they're blending the ideas, and so we see some of these ideas manifest in a cookbook.
Mm.
Paul Buell, one of his great scholarly works and contributions is a book known as Soup for the Khan.
Mm.
And it's a cookbook from the Yuan era that gets written down in the Ming Dynasty. And the idea is that you want to eat certain foods because of the medical properties they have. And so, with the recipe, you also get this is good for if you have, this ailment or that ailment, things like that. And we see Islamic texts get transferred into China. We see also food get transferred around the world. The old story about Marco Polo bringing spaghetti to Italy.
Mhm.
Well, he didn't, but it's that idea where we see people bringing what they like to eat. And part of this is because the Mongols do move people around. When the Mongols conquer, they capture populations, and sometimes they'll move them to other areas. Like when they first start conquering northern China and then Central Asia, they'll take many of these people, skilled workers, back to Mongolia where they're building a capital. And in Karakorum, the medieval capital of the Mongol Empire, we'll see a quarter of the city that it houses Muslim workers, as well as a Chinese quarter of workers, families that will be there for generations. But we'll also see a French silversmith who's captured in Hungary
Mm.
in this place. So we'll see all sorts of people moving together, and wherever people go, they'll want to still cook food in a way that they recognize. They may adapt to new things, but they'll still try to do things their old way, and if they're able to, they'll bring those foods with them. Like if it's a voluntary move, they'll probably bring some familiar things or try to access it. And of course, with these new trade routes or the security trade routes and the less expensive trade, you're able to do this. You can get chickpeas from the Middle East and bring them to China. You can bring, Chinese rhubarb to the Middle East, and
Mhm.
you name it, it moves around.
And of course, spices, because spices
Spices
are,
are always
yeah,
important.
yeah.
And so we'll see the transfer of a lot of spices around. They'll become more accessible. And once the Mongol Empire starts falling to pieces, and when empires fall, there's always chaos. And so a lot of these trade routes will then get cut off. And this is what's going to inspire guys like Christopher Columbus to try and find new trade routes.
Mhm.
And part of that is because, again, you have trade routes cutting off, and also trade routes are being rerouted because of the lack of security in the old areas. In the new areas, well, once you get a monopoly on a lot of the trade, like in Egypt with the Mamluk Sultanate, you can jack up the prices.
and
So
and
again,
also, yeah,
you want to find a new place, new route.
yeah. Also, the Ottoman Empire was another one that began to pop up a little bit later, and
Yeah, and
yeah.
again, the Ottomans come out of the vacuum of what is now Turkey, but the Mongols used to rule that.
Yeah.
And for a long time, Turkish scholars in particular, they would say, "Oh, no, 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 the Ottomans got their ideas from the Seljuks who ruled before them." No, the Mongols removed the Seljuks, but there's also evidence to suggest that the very early Ottomans, um, they were either pushed into the area by the Mongols, or they were actually a losing faction in a civil war in the steppes of Ukraine, and they fled into what is Turkey, and established a base. But again, they're able to do so because there's a vacuum with the collapse of Mongol authority in the area. And
Yeah.
again, they use Mongol institutions for a while until they start developing their own as they conquer new areas and bring in new influences. Every state is like this. Once they get a firm grounding, they're able to figure out what works best for them in whatever situation. But you still see Mongol influences in the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, like the dichotomy between the Sepahis of the early Ottoman Empire and then the later Janissaries as time goes on.
Yeah,
Uh,
and also just in some of the institutions, like the millet. The millet was a system how they basically ruled the non-Muslim populations. Basically, religious communities were left to their own devices. The leader of the religious community would sort of be the representative to the Sultan. The Mongols sort of did this too, particularly as they began to choose a religion. We see the Mongol Empire kind of divide between Buddhism and Islam. And if you look at a map, the line today of the Buddhist world and the Muslim world kind of follows that division of the Mongols. The Mongols didn't call it the millet system. We don't know if they really had a term for it, but we see them doing similar things. And that's not something that I think is widely recognized amongst the Ottomans or the Mongols for that matter. We just kind of, we get used to reading the sources and you don't think too much about it. But once you see the pattern, it's like, oh yeah, this is a conscious decision.
yeah. Well, and I sort of an extension of that because you mentioned like a lot of the armies in Eastern Europe, developing their tactics. A good example of that would be one that you mentioned in the Mongol conquest of world history, the Polish-Lithuanian Union, Commonwealth, whatever you want to call it. While they were never directly under rule of the Mongol Empire, they sort of developed their tactics to deal with Mongol raids and things like that. And then by proxy, you could also extend that a little bit further to the Swedish Empire under the Gustav dynasty, because their most common opponents were the Polish Lithuanians, and they began to develop their cavalry to deal with the Polish Lithuanian cavalry as well. So,
yeah, and the Muscovy, or the early Russian Empire, for a long time, their primary enemies are offshoots of the Mongol Empire. They're just Muscovy is a early successor state to the Mongols, competing with other Mongol successors. The Crimean Khanate, the Kazan Khanate, the Astrakhan Khanate. They're all successors. And Muscovy eventually wins out. But because Muscovy is also in contention with, powers like Sweden and others, they will start to adapt to fighting them in a different way. Particularly as gunpowder weapons become better. It's going to be not really until the 1700s that muskets are better than the composite bow. Cannons, definitely. I mean, once you have cannons that can move easily around the battlefield, that's a game changer. But a musket, an early arquebus, if you can get off a shot every 2 minutes, you're doing really well. Meanwhile, an archer is going to be able to shoot a couple dozen arrows into you in 2 minutes. But if you have cannons that can break up their formations, you have a real chance.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say, as somebody who has experience, knowledge of other parts of the world, that's for people watching. That's sort of the standard in a lot of places. For example, when Hernando de Soto was exploring the southeast, well, yes,
Mhm.
they had muskets. A lot of his men also had crossbows and things like that because crossbows were, had a better firing rate and things like that. So it was fairly standard across the board
Yeah.
until muskets got better. Um, so
Yeah, and if you look at the Russian expansion, they're avoiding the steppes until the 1700s, really.
mm,
So they won't have to tangle with the horse archers as much.
yeah. Well, and then even then, eventually like the Zungar Khanate and things like that start adopting muskets and such as well. So I mean, it really starts evening out,
Yep.
anyways. So, um, so here, what was I going to say? So we're approaching the end. One of the things I wanted to ask about, a couple of things I want to ask about. Um, so you mentioned with medical knowledge, the like Muslim medical knowledge transferring east. What like Chinese, like East Asian medical knowledge transferred west, if any?
Um, you don't get as much that really sticks.
Mhm.
You get some ideas that kind of how should I put this? Uh, again, you really have to peel back layers
Mhm.
to find out what it is. But again, and a lot of the ideas are sort of similar to what is already there in Galenic medicine in
Mhm.
terms of understanding health and conditions in terms of uh, part of its nutrition. The
Yeah,
use of certain foods will help alleviate this. And but particular spices and seasonings and stuff like that, but also um, the use of the pulse
Mhm.
and also uh, continuing to improve the understanding of anatomy. It's not that there's just one thing, but it's the fusion of ideas that start
yeah,
getting in there. Um, so the Chinese medicine also brings in the knowledge from the Islamic world and the Tibetan Buddhist world. It takes that knowledge and then shapes it into a Chinese understanding in the Muslim world, a Muslim understanding of it, so that it kind of seamlessly blends in. Um, so that again, you can't just easily say, oh yes, this is definitely Chinese. But we
yeah.
see in the it's at this point that certain ideas become more prevalent.
Mhm.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
About how to understand how the body works or how diseases work
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
how to treat them, of course.
Yeah, yeah, and I have seen a couple of papers. They're the authors of which I'm spacing on, but like one talked about the exchange, the use of like Chinese manuals,
Mm-hmm.
medical manuals that were like very clearly copied almost one to one by Muslim scholars. Like they in the paper they actually showed the pages, in comparison. And it's like, okay, this is very clearly, there's at least, if not similarities, they're, at least borrowing from each other,
Yeah.
sort of thing. Um, which doesn't surprise me at all. And I'm glad you mentioned the pulse because that is something that I knew about, but that or at least I had heard about, and I wanted, elaborated on a little bit. Now the other thing I wanted to ask as we are, you know, uh, getting towards the end of this, so you mentioned gunpowder, and and something I agree on that there's not a lot of archaeological evidence that they used it west of East Asia. And something that you, you know I like to mention to people and that I've actually discussed with fellow archaeologists because I actually am an archaeologist.
Mm-hmm.
Is one archaeologist that I talked about is he's because I asked him, I was like, well, how would we go about proving, for example, in the sieges of the various Ismaili fortresses, how we go about, you know, like say testing for carbon and such to find that. And he's like, well, that's the thing. You can test it, but it doesn't, prove that, gunpowder weapons or anything was used. In fact, a lot of archaeologists over the years, with the exception of using it for carbon 14 dating, won't even collect charcoal or ash or anything like that anymore because it's just not, you know, that useful for proving stuff
Yeah.
archaeologically. Um, except for like, oh, this is when this piece of charcoal is from, so therefore, the site is uh
Right. And
based off. Yeah,
not only is there no archaeological evidence for this, but there's no real documentary evidence.
yeah,
There's to quote the great military theoretician Marvin the Martian, where's the earth shattering kaboom?
yeah,
There's no mention of explosions. You do
yeah,
have a description of, describing the flight of uh, a ballista bolt where one scholar has posited that it's, there it has bags of gunpowder
mm,
attached to it. So, it's basically a giant fire arrow. Um, it's described as a meteor. Well, yeah, that's all fine and good, but if you turn the page, that Juvayni, that Persian author, he
mm,
describes everything in purple prose.
yeah,
You can't have just a rock. It is a rock that is like, you know, I don't have the poetic voice to describe it, but
yeah,
it's going to be something grand and extravagant and
yeah,
things like that. He can't write 2 words where 20 would do.
yeah,
So we have no descriptions from people who were at the battle, at the siege.
mm,
We have no mention of, oh, these are some secret weapons.
yeah,
No one's describing that. They'll describe, oh yes, they brought up the catapults, they brought up the giant crossbows, the ballistas. They're swinging swords in left and right, but we don't have any mention of.
yeah,
And then they brought up the bombs or the things
yeah,
that go boom,
yeah,
or any other kind of device. And it's like, well, yeah, you could make the incendiary forms of gunpowder, but in the Middle East, you also have a lot of access to naphtha, which is
mhm,
pretty darn effective.
yeah. Well, and then another thing that I have argued, or not, well, sorry, I haven't argued in any papers or like any videos, but something that I have like mused on is the even if it was used at say the one of the sieges of like these Mali fortresses, even when gunpowder weapons were in heavily in use. For example, in the Hundred Years' War, in the siege of Haflor, when Henry V is laying siege to it, he has gunpowder weapons there,
Yeah,
but they're not the deciding factor in what takes the city. And even then,
exactly.
after taking the city, he no longer has any gunpowder weapons to use at the subsequent Battle of Agincourt. He has to resort to bows and arrows and things like that. So
Yeah,
and I know the skull you're talking about with the ballista in the meteor, and you know, um, I can say that like maybe okay in that one siege, and I agree with you that probably not, but maybe for the sake of the argument, in that one siege they did use them. It's very clear that if that was the case, like in the siege of Haflor, they had nothing left afterwards, and they had to resort to using other weapons regardless. And like you said, there's no good evidence for
yeah.
them using it there to begin with. So
Yeah, unless it's a game changer, then
yeah,
it's like, okay, well, it was a novelty, but
yeah,
big deal.
yeah, exactly. Well, because again, naphtha is readily accessible. Throwing massive rocks. Ballistas themselves were effective without adding other stuff. So I
Right.
mean,
And when it comes down to it, you can shoot fire arrows, you can shoot things that, burst into flame, but it's much more difficult to get things to catch fire. It's not like the movies.
yeah,
You do have to prepare it. Like launching casks of oil and then, shooting flaming arrows and stuff like that. Because I've shot flaming arrows at hay bales, and
Yeah.
those hay bales are a lot tougher to catch on fire than you think.
Mhm.
You have to work at it a little bit. If you
Yeah.
prepare it first, they catch on fire quite easily. But if you don't, and the arrow goes deep into the hay bale, it extinguishes itself.
Yeah, it's sort of like
So
putting a bunch of dirt on it, sort of,
yeah,
or especially if the straw, or straw roofs are or thatch roofs are wet from rain
yeah,
or something
yeah.
like that. Yeah,
There
yeah,
are simple defenses against fire arrows as well.
yeah.
Like, we'll put some water on it, and
Well, and then
by golly,
also,
it works.
yeah, and then also another important thing that involves both gunpowder weapons and non-gunpowder weapons. In the movies, you see when they like lob, for example, rocks at walls, like, oh, they've collapsed the wall and they start charging in. Is a lot of like medieval historians and like uh weapon specialists are like, no, most of the time that would just still be a wall even after it collapsed. And
Yeah,
we have records of archers just simply like walking on the collapsed piles of rock to fire back at the besiegers. So
yeah,
that's not at all how that works. So
yep.
so okay. So are there any other things that you mentioned in the video that you didn't mention in the video that you would like to discuss?
Um, Not that I can think of. I mean, the Chinggis Exchange is a huge moment in world history.
Mhm.
Everything is affected by it. The world cannot go back to being what it was before the rise of the Mongols because of the exchange of information, the exchange of ideas, technology, and again, the movement of people. We have all sorts of population moving around willingly and unwillingly that
Mhm.
completely alter the dynamics of the world. So the Mongol Empire is one of those pivotal moments, and I would argue, and I have argued, that it is what sets up the conditions for the modern world.
Mhm.
The modern era in history, basically comes around because of what the Mongols did, both intentionally and unintentionally.
Mhm. And other scholars, of course, have talked about that as well. Like Jack Weatherford is one who's got that blockbuster book that has
Yep.
exactly that title, but he's not the only one. There are others that have said the same thing as well. So it's a very important time in history, very much so.
Yes.
Uh, you know, um, so yeah, and so yeah, I guess to finish off, so what are some of your because you mentioned the like I said the Mongol conquests and world history and such. What are some of your other books or sources from other scholars that you would recommend
Um, uh,
about the
of
Mongol
my
Empire?
books, if you're interested in warfare, the Mongol Art of War.
Mhm.
Um, I also have a popular biography called Simply Chinggis. It's the title comes from basically the series where everything is simply that,
Mhm.
simply
Yeah.
Einstein, simply Tchaikovsky, things like that.
Mhm.
But it's intended for a more an educated, popular audience. And it goes into why it's Chinggis, not the G word.
Yeah.
Um, and also the long-term impact of the perception of Chinggis Khan. And I have a couple books that are general histories of the Mongol Empire. The one called The Mongol Empire, another one called The Mongols, where I actually get to start the book with "It was a dark and stormy night." Um, and I was able to slip that past the editor. And for all your needs in Mongol history, I and my colleague Michael Hope edited a book called The Mongol World. It's 1,000 pages, over 1,000 pages. You can use it as a desk, throw
Mhm.
it at a burglar and you'll kill them. Um, it's quite expensive, but the ebook is actually very reasonably priced for
Mhm.
the size of the book. But if you really want a good foundation of the Mongol Empire, between that and the Cambridge History of the Mongol Empire, which just came out this year, um, you'd be well set.
Okay.
They're very complementary because when I have a chapter in the Cambridge history of the Mongol Empire, so I knew what they were writing about, and so we tried to make sure that our book, the Mongol world, was a bit different from it, and not covering the exact same material. And so between
Mhm.
those two, you'll get a really good workout on the history of the Mongol Empire. And if you have both sets in physical copy, you can actually get a very good workout just lifting them.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, with that, thank you for coming on and telling us
My pleasure.
about the Mongol Empire and the Chinggis Exchange. Um, and everyone watching, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Check out some of the sources that Dr. Timothy May mentioned here, as well as I'm sure like you can go, for example, go to his like profile at like his university, and most professors have like selected works listed in their uh, stuff on those profiles also. And just everyone have a good day. And again, thank you, Dr. Timothy May, for coming on. So,
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
so what is that? Okay.